Gunfire cracked through the trees without warning. Metal screamed as bullets tore into the transport truck. Boots splashed through frozen mud. A radio screamed once, then went dead. Someone was shouting in German. Someone else was crying, and in the chaos, 3 women raised their hands. No one noticed at first, but the moment they were taken alive, everything changed, because these women survived capture. Yet every one of them later refused to describe what happened next. Not to investigators, not to historians, not even to their own families. They would speak about the ambush. They would speak about surrender, but when asked what happened after the blindfolds went on, their voices stopped. One survivor shook so violently she had to be escorted out of the room. Another simply whispered, "Some things don't end when the war does." And then something impossible happened. Asterisk, the year was 1944. The location, a fractured corridor between advancing Allied forces and collapsing German lines, a place where maps changed daily and units vanished. Overnight, the women involved were not ordinary civilians. They were trained personnel, couriers, communications specialists, medical, auxiliaries, intelligence adjutants attached to frontline divisions, women whose names rarely appeared in official combat records, but whose knowledge could shift battles, expose resistance cells, or collapse entire operations. If captured, they carried more than weapons. They carried roots, frequencies, names, and that made them dangerous. Captured soldiers were expected to talk. Eventually, broken, starved, threatened. But these women didn't break. They returned after the war physically alive, yet something about them was absent. No medals, no interviews, no memoirs, only sealed files and unanswered questions. But no one realized the real threat hadn't even appeared yet. Asterisk. The moment that changed everything did not begin with gunfire. It began with silence. At exactly 3:17 hours, radio operators across 3 different command sectors noticed something wrong. Static dropped. The background hiss, constant in wartime communications, suddenly flattened, as if the air itself had been pressed down. Then a signal appeared. It wasn't strong. It wasn't clear. And it wasn't using any known call sign. The transmission cut across multiple frequencies at once. Allied tactical channels, Axis emergency bands, even a neutral Red Cross wavelength that was supposed to be locked. Operators froze. This wasn't technically possible. They leaned closer to their headsets as fragments slipped through. Numbers, grid references, a time marker, and then a sentence, distorted, repeated twice, as if whoever sent it needed to be absolutely certain it was heard. Do not question the women. No rank. No authorization code. No sender ID. Just that sentence. Within seconds, command rooms erupted. Maps were pulled down. Logbooks flipped open. Encryption officers began scrambling through cipher tables that didn't match the signal structure. This wasn't German. It wasn't Allied. And it wasn't resistance shorthand. It didn't belong to anyone, and yet it carried authority. Moments later, a second anomaly appeared. A field unit reported enemy flares rising before they were launched, logged in the system minutes before soldiers on the ground physically saw them. Another patrol received coordinates that led directly to an ambush, one that hadn't happened yet. Timestamps didn't align. Someone knew what was coming, and someone knew who would survive it. As the ambush unfolded, the one that ended with the capture of 3 female personnel, the earlier transmission was replayed. Analyzed frame by frame, that's when an intelligence officer noticed something chilling, buried between static. Pulses was a secondary pattern, a rhythm, almost like breathing. When isolated, it formed a repetition interval that matched heartbeat telemetry used only in medical evacuation units. Why would a battlefield transmission carry biometric timing? And then came the detail that stopped the room cold. Written in pencil on the decoded transcripts margin added by someone who had been listening live, was a single note. She is with them. No surname. No rank. Just she. No one admitted to writing it. Orders began to conflict. immediately. One command demanded interrogation upon capture. Another insisted on immediate transfer. A third quietly requested the women be processed without documentation. That phrase had no official meaning, yet it was obeyed. Convoys were rerouted. Escort units reassigned mid-mission. Records delayed, then altered. And as the blindfolds went on, one of the women reportedly asked a single question. Did they hear it too? The guard never answered, because at that moment, every radio in the sector crackled once more briefly, and then went dead. And the next 90 seconds would determine whether anyone survived. Asterisk. The removal order was never spoken out loud. No messenger arrived. No stamped directive appeared. Yet just before dawn, everyone involved somehow knew. The women were no longer staying where they were. Guards, who had stood watch through the night, stepped aside without being told. A vehicle convoy rolled in from the mist, engines already warm, headlights dimmed, markings deliberately obscured. The drivers did not present papers. No one asked for them. That silence, the lack of verification, was the first. Break-in protocol. The women were escorted out one by one. Not shoved. Not rushed. Each was given time to stand, adjust her coat, and step forward. One later recalled how strange it felt, like being guided onto a stage rather than into custody. Their hands were not bound. That detail would trouble investigators years later. Blindfolds were applied, but loosely enough to obscure vision, not enough to restrict breathing. It was restraint without force, control without aggression. Whoever designed the transfer understood psychology better than procedure. As the convoy began to move, radios across the sector failed in a precise pattern. Not all at once. Not randomly. Each unit lost contact exactly as the vehicles crossed a specific distance. Marker 1 later reconstructed using partial logs and witness estimates. Static did not increase. Signals did not degrade. They simply ceased. Inside command posts, officers noticed immediately. Repeated calls went unanswered. Backup frequencies failed. Even wired field lines carried nothing but a faint, rhythmic hum. Technicians checked equipment and found nothing wrong, one signals officer wrote in his report. Feels intentional, like being excluded rather than disrupted. On the road, the environment itself seemed to shift. Drivers followed routes that should not have existed. Narrow forest paths cutting through terrain marked as impassable. Trees grew too close together. The ground dipped and rose in ways that made distance impossible to judge. Escort soldiers grew uneasy. One asked quietly where they were headed. The driver didn't answer, not because he refused, but because his mouth moved without producing sound. Another soldier later swore the sun did not move during the drive. He checked his watch repeatedly, convinced it had stopped, until he realized the second hand was moving, but the light outside remained unchanged. Time felt stretched, then compressed, then unreliable. Inside the vehicles, the women experienced something worse than fear, anticipation without context. They listened to the engines, counted turns, tried to measure distance by vibration and slope. But the sensations refused to align. Movement did not match direction. Stops occurred without deceleration. Starts without acceleration. One woman whispered that she felt they were driving in circles. Another felt certain. They were descending, though her ears never popped. No one spoke above a murmur at one point. The convoy stopped completely. No doors opened. No commands were given. They waited seconds or minutes. No one could later agree, and then the engines restarted. When the vehicles finally halted for the last time, the silence outside was absolute. No birds. No wind. No distant artillery. The blindfolds came off indoors. The structure they were led into did not resemble a camp, prison, or a military facility. Walls were smooth, unmarked. Lighting was diffuse, neither harsh nor dim, and came from no visible source. There were no insignia, no flags, no portraits, no identifying features of any nation. The escorts did not follow them inside. That was the moment several soldiers refused to go. Any further? One reportedly muttered. This wasn't in the war. Back at headquarters, confusion reached critical levels. Commanders demanded updates that could not be provided. Logs contradicted each other. A unit appeared to have crossed the same checkpoint twice, 10 minutes apart without turning around. An analyst noticed that revised reports were appearing before initial drafts had been. File.cause was following effect. Someone higher up issued a blanket order. Do not interfere. Do not pursue. The phrasing was unusual. It did not instruct action, only restraint, and it carried no name. Meanwhile, inside the facility, the women were separated, not violently, not abruptly. Doors closed behind them with a soft spinal sound that felt permanent. Each room was clean, warm, almost comforting. That comfort was deliberate. Meals arrived without explanation. Injuries were treated with care. No one demanded information. No one raised their voice. No one asked questions. That absence became unbearable because war had taught them how cruelty looked. This was something else. At irregular intervals, they sensed presence, not footsteps, not shadows, but attention, as if someone were standing just out of sight, listening not to their words, but to their thoughts. One woman knocked on the wall. There was no echo. Another tried to sleep, and woke convinced she had missed an entire day, or gained one, when they were finally addressed. It was not by rank or name. It was by observation. A voice remarked calmly. Your heart rate changed when you remembered the river. She had not spoken aloud. That was when panic set in, not screaming panic. Contained. Disciplined terror. Because whatever had taken them was not improvising. It was studying and outside, far beyond the walls. Officers realized something chilling. This was no longer an extraction. It was an operation already past the point of control. And the real danger hadn't even begun yet. Asterisk, what happened next did not feel like captivity. That was the first thing every survivor struggled to explain. There were no bars, no locked doors they could see, no shouted orders or visible threats. Instead, there was structure, precise, calm, almost gentle. Each woman remained isolated, yet none felt alone. The rooms were identical in size, but subtly different in sensation. One felt warmer near the walls. Another carried a faint metallic smell that came and went without warning. Light did not flicker, yet it never seemed to come from a single source. Time stopped behaving normally. Meals arrived at regular intervals, but the women could not tell whether those intervals were hours or days apart. Sleep came suddenly, without exhaustion, and ended just as abruptly. Dreams felt sharper than waking moments, detailed and persistent, as if they were being continued rather than imagined. And then the questioning began. Not in a room, not across a table. The voices came from nowhere and everywhere at once. They did not introduce themselves. They did not demand names, ranks, or allegiances. Instead, they asked things no interrogator ever would. They asked about childhood, not dates or places, but sensations. The smell of wet earth. The sound of footsteps behind a door. The first moment fear was remembered rather than felt. When one woman hesitated, the voice filled in the answer for her accurately. That was when resistance began to collapse, because the voices were not guessing, they were confirming. The women tried to lie. It didn't work. False answers were met with silence, not punishment, followed by repetition of the question, slightly adjusted, as if refining a measurement. Then the questions changed. They asked about moments that had not happened, yet about choices the women did not remember making. 1. A woman was asked why she had hesitated before stepping into the transport truck, a hesitation she had never consciously noticed. Another was asked whether she would make the same decision again. When she demanded to know what decision they meant, the voice replied, "You will understand when the memory catches up." Physical symptoms followed. Heart rate spiked without cause. Hands trembled uncontrollably. Vision blurred, not from fatigue, but from overload. One woman attempted to scream. No sound came out. Medical examinations later confirmed her vocal cords were intact. There was no injury, no swelling, no explanation. The fear was not of pain, it was of exposure, because memories. The women had never spoken, never even fully acknowledged, were being replayed back to them with impossible precision. Not as accusations, but as data. At one point, a woman was shown a map, not a standard military map, but a layered projection of lines and symbols that shifted as she looked at it. Front lines overlapped, borders blurred, routes appeared, vanished, and reappeared elsewhere. She pointed to an inconsistency. The voice paused and corrected it and thanked her. That was the moment she realized the truth. They were not being interrogated. They were being tested, evaluated for perception, for recall. For awareness beyond linear time, the women began to sense that the questions were not about the war. Not this war, but about how humans experience conflict. Fear and choice, one voice asked. When did you first understand that survival is not the same as safety? No one had ever asked her that before. At some point, and no one could later say when, the questioning stopped. There was no conclusion, no final statement, no explanation. The women were blindfolded again. The transport resumed. When they were returned to Allied control, they appeared unharmed. Clean uniforms, stable vitals. No signs of detention, but something fundamental had changed. Investigators noticed it immediately. Eye contact was difficult. Responses were delayed. Hands trembled when questions approached certain subjects. When asked directly about captivity, one woman opened her mouth, then stopped. Her face went pale. She whispered, "If I explain it, it might still be listening." That sentence appeared in multiple reports, recorded independently by different officers. Doctors could not classify the trauma. It did not match known combat stress. It did not align with interrogation. Shock. It was as if the women had learned something they were never meant to carry, and their minds were actively preventing it from surfacing. Then orders came down. Interviews were halted. Files were sealed. Transfers were authorized without explanation. And in a moment no historian could ever fully reconstruct, the truth slipped out of reach. Because whatever happened during captivity was not designed to be remembered, and the war itself suddenly felt like the least important part of the story. Asterisk, the war ended the way wars usually do, with signatures, announcements, and crowds celebrating survival. Cities were liberated. Flags were raised. Histories began forming almost immediately. But for the women who survived capture, the end never truly arrived. Their records showed release dates, medical clearances, and transport logs, yet none of it explained the hollow distance that followed them home. They returned physically intact, but something fundamental had been displaced, as if a part of them had been left behind in a place that officially did not exist. Military doctors were the first to notice that the symptoms did not align with anything they recognized. These were not the shaking hands or nightmares associated with shell shock. There were no visible triggers, no loud noises that caused panic, no obvious flashbacks. Instead, the women displayed a quieter disturbance, pauses in speech, moments where time seemed to slip away mid-sentence, expressions of fear without a clear source. When questioned, they did not refuse to answer. They simply couldn't. Language failed them at the edge of memory, as if their minds were actively sealing something off. Investigators pushed gently at first, then more firmly. They asked about locations, names, uniforms, insignia, anything that could be cataloged. The women could describe the moment of capture in precise detail. They could recount the weather, the gunfire, the orders shouted in confusion. But when the questions crossed a certain invisible line, when they reached the point after surrender, every response collapsed. Some women went silent. Others became physically ill. One began crying without understanding why. The consistency of the reaction disturbed the investigators more than any single answer could have. As weeks passed, pressure came from above. Reports were shortened. Interview requests were denied. Entire sections of testimony were removed and replaced with neutral phrases like subject, unable to recall, or no actionable. Intelligence obtained, eventually. A directive arrived instructing all units to cease further inquiry into the incident. The order did not explain why. It did not threaten punishment. It simply stated that continued investigation was not advised. That phrasing alone was enough. The question stopped. The women were reassigned or discharged quietly. Some returned to civilian life and avoided anything that reminded them of the war. Others withdrew completely, choosing isolation over explanation. A few married and raised families, but even their closest relatives later admitted they never truly knew them. Certain topics caused conversations to end abruptly. Certain memories were never shared. Photographs disappeared. Diaries were burned. It was not secrecy born of loyalty. It was fear of reopening something that had been deliberately closed. Asterisk, years later, when historians began examining declassified material, the gaps became impossible to ignore. Files referenced facilities with no coordinates. Transfer logs listed units that had never officially existed. Medical assessments contradicted themselves, noting severe psychological impact without a causal event. In one archive, a folder contained nothing but a cover sheet and a red stamp reading, "Do not pursue further." No signature. No date. Just finality. Only one personal document survived intact, a diary discovered long after the woman who wrote it had died. Most of its pages were blank, as if they had never been filled. But on several pages near the end, the same sentence appeared again and again. Written carefully, without variation, "We were not prisoners." There was no explanation beneath it. No elaboration. Just that statement, repeated like a boundary marker, the writer refused to cross. To this day, no official explanation has been offered. No government has claimed responsibility. No agency has denied involvement. The women who survived never contradicted one another, not because they compared stories, but because none of them ever told one. Whatever happened after capture did not follow the logic of war, interrogation, or confinement. It existed outside normal categories, preserved only in silence and sealed records. And that is what makes the story endure. Because wars leave scars that can be traced, battles mapped, losses counted, victories claimed. But this left something else behind, a knowledge so destabilizing that even survival came with a cost. The women lived on, but the truth did not follow them back. And somewhere, locked away in archives still closed to the public, lies the answer to what they experienced after surrender. Waiting, unchanged, in the dark. Just like it always has been.